Before we begin the episode, we would like to send out a special thanks to Green Chef, a USDA-certified organic company, for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Please visit greenchef.us/cold75 to receive a total of $75 off. That's $25 each off your first 3 boxes of Green Chef meals. Once again, that's greenchef.us/cold75. Thank you, and enjoy the show. March 2nd, 1995. New Orleans, Louisiana. After leaving a restaurant with his date in the French Quarter, 25-year-old Michael Gerardi is fatally gunned down by a trio of robbers. Weeks later, 16-year-old Shareef Cousin is implicated in the crime and charged with first-degree murder. Even though Shareef seems to have an airtight alibi, Michael's date identifies him as the shooter at trial, and he is found guilty and sentenced to death. However, it turns out the district attorney's office withheld exculpatory evidence and committed prosecutorial misconduct. After nearly 3 years on death row, Shareef's conviction is overturned, but Michael Gerardi's real killers are never found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a truly jaw-dropping story to cover today. The 1995 murder of Michael Gerardi, and the subsequent wrongful conviction of Shareef Cousin. As you probably know, only a few days after the release of this episode, I will be appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon in New Orleans, which is why I decided to select a New Orleans-themed case this week. In the end, I wound up falling down a rabbit hole and exploring one of the most outrageous miscarriages of justice you'll ever hear. The defendant in this story is an African-American teenager named Shareef Cousin, who was only 16 years old when he was arrested for the murder of Michael Gerardi, and 17 when he was sentenced to death for the crime, making him one of the youngest people to ever be sent to death row. Given Shareef's young age, this decision was bound to be controversial, regardless of whether or not he was guilty of the crime. However, it soon became apparent that the people who put Shareef away had to have known he didn't do it, but were determined to convict him no matter what. I've seen a lot of wrongful convictions involving prosecutorial misconduct, but the prosecutors in this case just went to insane lengths to withhold and fabricate evidence, even though it meant an innocent kid would wind up being executed for a crime he did not commit. Throughout all this injustice, one aspect of this story which gets overlooked is that the real killer of Michael Gerardi has never been found, even though there were some promising suspects who seemed to slip under the radar. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. And one more thing I wanted to mention, if you're in New Orleans for CrimeCon this coming weekend, we are holding an informal podcaster-listener meetup on Saturday night, June the 8th, at the Spirits Bar at the Hilton Riverside Hotel at 8 p.m. A number of podcasters are going to be in attendance, and it's open to the public, so even if you did not purchase tickets to CrimeCon, you can still come on down and hang out with us. That's Saturday, June 8th at 8 p.m. at the Spirits Bar at the Hilton Riverside Hotel in New Orleans. Hope to see you there. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore a story of outrageous injustice. Our story begins in New Orleans in 1995, and our victim is 25-year-old Alfred Michael Gerardi, who goes by the name Michael, and lives in the nearby town of Slidell. On the evening of March 2nd, Michael went out with 37-year-old Connie Babin. They had recently met at a Mardi Gras party in New Orleans' French Quarter before Michael phoned Connie up to ask her out. They decided to return to the French Quarter for their first date together and went out to dinner at the Port of Call restaurant on Esplanade Avenue. After they finished dinner, the couple left the restaurant and walked towards Michael's pickup truck, which was parked half a block away. At 10:26 p.m., they reached the truck when 3 African-American males appeared and headed towards them. Once it became apparent that one of the men was moving towards them in a threatening fashion, Michael turned towards Connie and told her to run away. Connie immediately took off, but as she was running, she looked behind her and saw that one of the black males was holding out a gun, and he proceeded to shoot Michael in the face. Connie made it back to the Port of Call restaurant and called 911 for assistance. When police arrived at the scene, they found Connie kneeling next to Michael's body and clutching his hand, but by then, he was already dead. Since Michael's wallet was missing, robbery was the apparent motive for his murder. A few weeks later, investigators got a promising lead when 16-year-old James Rowell was arrested and charged with 9 counts of armed robbery. Rowell implicated a 16-year-old friend of his named Shareef Cousin, who had allegedly bragged to him about being responsible for the murder of Michael Gerardi. Shareef was one of 8 siblings being raised by a single mother in the 9th Ward of New Orleans. Even though Shareef grew up without a father and his family struggled with poverty, he was known for being an intelligent kid who did well in school. However, things started to change when Shareef took the initiative to finally track down and meet his biological father, who refused to acknowledge that Shareef was his son. This reaction devastated Shareef and sent him on a downward spiral as his attitude changed, his grades started to fall, and he soon got involved in drugs. After being sent to a substance abuse treatment center, Shareef became friends with James Rowell, who turned out to be a bad influence. Shareef allegedly accompanied Rowell on some of his armed robberies, though he claimed he never got directly involved or carried a weapon, and only waited in Rowell's car. Anyway, when Rowell implicated Shareef in Michael Gerardi's murder, he was picked up by police and taken down to the station on March 28th. He was placed in a lineup where Connie Babin positively identified him as the shooter, and Shareef was soon formally charged with first-degree murder. But this would not be the only charge that Shareef would face. On the basis of Rowell's story, police believed Shareef was also part of a gang of teenagers who had been committing robberies throughout the city and charged him with 4 additional counts of armed robbery. The case wound up in the hands of the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office, and they announced that they were planning to try Shareef 4 times for each separate count of armed robbery before they even tried him for murder. If convicted on all the armed robbery charges, Shareef could potentially receive 99 years in prison. He was also going to be tried in adult court for Michael Gerardi's murder, and if found guilty, he would be facing the death penalty. Shareef maintained that he was innocent of both the murder and the robberies, but his defense attorneys presented him with a difficult choice. They told Shareef there was no way they could possibly win 4 separate armed robbery trials and a murder trial, so they advised him to plead guilty to the robberies, as he would receive a 10-year prison sentence and likely only have to serve half that time. This way, they could devote all their energy to helping Shareef beat the murder charge and potentially save his life. Shareef reluctantly agreed to enter a guilty plea to the robberies, but came to regret the decision when he received a 20-year prison sentence instead of the expected 10. Nevertheless, Shareef and his defense team thought there was a very good chance they would win the murder trial since he seemed to have an airtight alibi. On the evening of March 2nd, Shareef was playing in a youth league basketball game at the Treme Recreation Community Center, and the evidence clearly backed up his alibi. His signature was on the sign-in sheet, there were several witnesses who could place him there, and there was even a videotape of Shareef playing in the game. Shareef's coach, Eric White, maintained that he drove him home that night and did not drop him off until 10:45 p.m., around 20 minutes after Michael Gerardi was murdered. But in spite of this, the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office still went ahead with Shareef's trial as planned. It began in January of 1996, and would be prosecuted by Assistant District Attorney Roger Jordan and his co-counsel Byron Berry. Since there was no physical evidence linking Shareef to the crime, and the murder weapon could not be found, the prosecution's case would hinge on the eyewitness testimony of Connie Babin. When she took the stand, Connie stated that she was positive that Shareef was the shooter and identified him, stating, quote, "I will never forget that face." The prosecution also believed that James Rowell's testimony would support their case, but received an unexpected surprise when he took the witness stand. Rowell recanted his original story, and now claimed that Shareef had never bragged to him that he shot Michael Gerardi. According to Rowell, when he was arrested on 9 counts of armed robbery, he was told by his defense attorney, George Cimino, that he could potentially be facing 800 years in prison, so Cimino asked if he had any information to offer which might help reduce that sentence. This is what led to Rowell implicating Shareef in Michael Gerardi's murder, though he claimed he was coerced and told what to say by the police and the 2 prosecuting attorneys when he gave his official deposition. In exchange for his testimony, Rowell would only receive a 15-year sentence, but was instructed not to mention this at trial. A sentencing hearing for Rowell's robbery charges had been scheduled by the district attorney's office, but they made a calculated decision not to hold the hearing until after Shareef's trial had concluded, so they would have no legal obligation to disclose this information to the defense. This revelation prompted the prosecution to call George Cimino and a detective named Daniel Wharton to the stand as impeachment witnesses. They both testified that they were present at the meeting when Rowell gave his deposition, and that he had implicated Shareef of his own free will without any coercion. The crux of the defense's case would be Shareef's alibi. Like I mentioned earlier, he was playing in a basketball game at the Recreation Community Center in the Treme neighborhood, and someone from the crowd had actually videotaped the game and captured Shareef in the footage. Not only that, but the video was time-stamped and seemed to show that there was no way Shareef would have had enough time to travel to the French Quarter and shoot Michael by 10:26 p.m. However, the prosecution argued that the timestamps could have been inaccurate if the video camera had not been set correctly. In spite of this, 2 recreation department supervisors, a player from the opposing team, and Shareef's coach, Eric White, appeared as witnesses to testify that the game ended sometime between 10:20 and 10:30 p.m., and White was adamant that he dropped Shareef off at his home at 10:45. The defense was also planning to present 3 of Shareef's teammates as alibi witnesses, as White had also driven them home and dropped them off before Shareef. But even though they were subpoenaed, none of the 3 teammates showed up in court on the day they were scheduled to testify, and they could not be located. Prosecutor Roger Jordan attempted to discredit Shareef's alibi by playing a recording of a prior interview he had conducted with Eric White in which he contradicted his testimony. In the recording, White could be heard saying that the game ended at 9:30, so Jordan argued that after being dropped off at home, Shareef still could have had enough time to travel to the French Quarter and murder Michael at 10:26. While making his closing statement to the jury, Jordan was describing the circumstances of the murder, which prompted Shareef to have an outburst by standing up and yelling out, "I wasn't there." In the end, the jury believed the prosecution's version of events, and on January the 26th, they found Shareef guilty of first-degree murder. The jury would subsequently deliberate on Shareef's sentencing and voted for him to receive the death penalty. However, there would be a months-long delay before sentencing could actually be passed. Almost immediately following the conviction, Shareef's team was mailed a recording from an anonymous source. It turned out to be a tape-recorded statement Connie had made when she was interviewed 3 days after the murder, and she stated that she was not wearing her glasses or contact lenses when she witnessed Michael get shot. Since it was dark at the time, Connie said that all she could really see was patterns and shapes, and she did not get a good look at the shooter or his 2 accomplices. The only information Connie could provide was that the shooter was slightly shorter than Michael, making him around 5'7" or 5'8", but Shareef was actually 4 inches taller than Michael. The defense was also able to obtain a copy of a report written by the first officer who interviewed Connie following the murder, where she stated she would probably not be able to identify anyone. This was in direct contradiction to Connie's trial testimony, in which she expressed her absolute certainty that Shareef was the shooter. Since neither the report nor the recording of Connie's interview were disclosed to the defense, they filed a motion for a new trial, but it was ultimately denied. The sentencing phase finally resumed, and on July 2nd, Shareef was sentenced to death by a lethal injection and transferred to death row at Louisiana State Prison in Angola. By this point, Shareef was still only 17 years old, making him the youngest person ever to be condemned to death in the history of Louisiana. Given Shareef's young age, the decision was a controversial one, and Shareef's supporters sought the assistance of Clive Stafford Smith, a British-born attorney who had become a prominent activist against the death penalty. He soon uncovered evidence of some egregious acts of misconduct which had been committed by both the New Orleans Police Department and the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office. The lead detective on this case had been Anthony Small, but disturbing allegations began to surface against him. Small had initially claimed that he uncovered 2 additional eyewitnesses besides Connie Babin who saw Shareef commit the murder, but they were never called upon to testify at trial. But it turned out the reason for this was because these witnesses did not actually exist. Small had allegedly lied about them, so he would have additional evidence to secure a warrant for Shareef's arrest. Clive Stafford Smith would also hear a shocking story from Small's ex-wife. On March 24, 1995, the Crime Stoppers tip line received a call from someone who claimed they had heard Shareef Cousin boasting about the murder, and Small made a note of this tip in a report. When Shareef was arrested a few days later, the tipster wound up receiving a reward of $10,500. Well, according to his ex-wife, Small was the person who phoned in the tip, and he got one of his friends to pose as the tipster so he could collect the reward and they could split the money together. There would also be disturbing allegations against prosecutors Roger Jordan and Byron Berry and the tactics they used to discredit Shareef's alibi defense. Remember how 3 of Shareef's teammates had been subpoenaed to testify that Shareef was with them when Coach White dropped them off after the game, but then they never showed up in court that day? Well, guess what? These witnesses did show up as planned that morning and were waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom when they were intercepted by Roger Jordan and Byron Berry, who instructed them to wait in the district attorney's office across the street. Without the defense's knowledge, the 3 teammates wound up waiting in the office all day and missing their scheduled time to testify until the prosecutors informed them that their testimony was no longer required. In the defense's eyes, the prosecution had practically kidnapped and illegally detained their witnesses. When questioned about these allegations, Byron Berry did admit that he had asked them to wait in the district attorney's office, but only did so because it was hot that day and thought the witnesses might be more comfortable waiting there because it was air-conditioned. Yeah, well, the problem was that the trial took place in January. In fact, one of the coldest Januaries in the history of New Orleans. But perhaps the most shocking allegation involved the tape-recorded statement of Coach Eric White's pre-trial interview with Roger Jordan. As you'll recall, White testified that the basketball game ended sometime between 10:20 and 10:30 p.m., but when he was asked what time the game ended during the recording, White could be heard answering 9:30. Theoretically, this still would have given enough time for Shareef to make it to the French Quarter to commit the murder at 10:26. Well, here's the issue. Multiple games took place at the recreation center that night, and an extra game was added at the last minute, which caused Shareef's game to be delayed. As a result, it did not actually start until 9:30. Coach White maintained that he only answered 9:30 when Jordan asked him what time the game started, not when it ended. According to White, when Jordan recorded the interview, he used a microcassette tape recorder, but when Jordan played back the recording during the trial, he used a regular tape recorder. As a result, White became convinced that Jordan had doctored the tape and edited his answer. He even went so far as to openly object when the tape was played in court, but he was not allowed to elaborate on this for the jury. If that wasn't enough, it turned out that investigators for the prosecution had also interviewed a pair of brothers who refereed the games that night, and they also stated that Shareef's game ended right before 10:30, but this information was never shared with the defense. While all these shocking revelations prompted Shareef's defense attorneys to file an appeal with the Louisiana Supreme Court, arguing that the prosecution had committed a number of Brady violations by withholding so much exculpatory evidence. They now believe there were major credibility issues. With Connie Babin's eyewitness testimony, there was literally no evidence that Shareef committed the crime. The defense also had issues with the prosecution's decision to call George Cimino and Detective Daniel Wharton to the stand as impeachment witnesses when James Rowell recanted his story. Their argument was that the prosecution was now using Cimino and Wharton's memories of Rowell's earlier statements to strengthen their case for Shareef's guilt, but that their testimony was nothing more than hearsay and should not have been considered evidence. Well, the Louisiana Supreme Court agreed with that particular argument and stated that a quote-unquote flagrant misuse of evidence had taken place. In April of 1998, they overturned Shareef's conviction and ordered a new trial. By this point, Shareef's case had already been featured on a number of television shows and generated a lot of controversy, but there was still uncertainty about whether or not he would be taken to trial again. The case garnered the attention of prominent human rights advocate Bianca Jagger, who announced her plans to travel to New Orleans and organize some protests and rallies for Shareef after the new year. Well, before any of this could happen, Shareef was suddenly offered a plea bargain on January the 8th, 1999. In exchange for pleading guilty to the murder, Shareef would be sentenced to time served and taken off death row, but he turned the deal down. Within a few hours, the Orleans Parish District Attorney, Harry Connick Sr., publicly announced that his office was going to drop the case against Shareef because there just wasn't enough evidence to go to trial again. Shareef was removed from death row, but he would still have to remain in prison to serve out the remainder of his sentence on the armed robbery charges he had pled guilty to. In spite of this, Shareef's family filed a civil lawsuit against the district attorney's office and the New Orleans Police Department, naming Roger Jordan, Byron Berry, and Detective Anthony Small as defendants. Harry Connick Sr. was also listed as a defendant, as they sought to hold him liable for his failure to properly train and supervise the prosecutors from his office. But in 2003, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit dismissed the lawsuit, ruling that Jordan and Berry were protected by the doctrine of absolute prosecutorial immunity and that Connick had qualified immunity. However, a separate complaint was filed against Jordan with the Louisiana Attorney Disciplinary Board for his alleged misconduct during Shareef's trial. In 2005, Jordan wound up being disciplined for his actions by the Louisiana Supreme Court, the first time they had ever done so to a prosecutor. But Jordan's punishment was nothing more than a 3-month suspension, which would be waived on the provision that he did not commit another ethics breach over the course of the next year. While most people considered this a slap on the wrist, Jordan still felt the ruling was too harsh and tarnished his otherwise unblemished record, so he made an unsuccessful attempt to appeal the decision. In September of that year, Shareef was paroled for his armed robbery charges, and he finally got to walk out of prison, though it was a very bittersweet feeling since Hurricane Katrina had destroyed his family's home less than 1 month beforehand, and he was forced to go live at a cousin's house in Bossier City. Shareef soon moved to Georgia and got a job as a legal clerk for the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta. He also wound up marrying a woman with 3 kids, and they soon had another child together, but Shareef found himself unable to financially support his new family. In 2008, Shareef faced more legal trouble when he was caught using his boss's name, birth date, and social security number in order to obtain credit cards and rack up $42,000 in purchases. Shareef pled guilty to identity fraud and credit card fraud and received a 10-year prison sentence. After serving 3 years, he was paroled for good behavior and eventually moved back to New Orleans. He has since become an activist for ending the death penalty in Louisiana and has become involved with helping the wrongly convicted. He has done work for such organizations as Witness to Innocence, a non-profit organization which supports people who have been exonerated from death row, and the Resurrection After Exoneration Project, which was founded by John Thompson, another wrongly convicted death row inmate who we will be discussing in a little while. In spite of everything that has happened, the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office still seems to hold the position that Shareef Cousin was guilty of Michael Gerardi's murder. As a result, Michael's real killers have never been brought to justice, and the crime technically remains unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, I would like to take a few moments to express my appreciation for Green Chef. You might recall that the Trail Went Cold has previously teamed up with the meal delivery service HelloFresh, and we've really enjoyed the meals they have sent us. Well, we are excited to announce that we have teamed up with Green Chef, a USDA organic company which is now owned by HelloFresh, in order to offer a wider selection of meal choices. Both brands have great offerings, and you can switch between them if you feel like eating differently each month. Green Chef is now offering everyone in our audience a total of $75 off. That's $25 off each of your first 3 boxes of Green Chef. All you have to do is go to greenchef.us/cold75. Their meal plans include paleo, vegan, vegetarian, pescatarian, keto, gluten-free, and omnivore. Each of these recipes are very easy to prepare since you will receive step-by-step instructions as well as tips and photos to serve as a useful guide. And because there are so many different options, you can switch up your meal plan and try all sorts of different ways to eat. There's quite a diverse variety of meal plans with a number of options to choose from every week, which will provide you with the satisfaction of sticking to your goals. As an example, my producer McGill's mother-in-law recently ordered and tried out the vegetarian plan offered by Green Chef. She particularly enjoyed the Mediterranean couscous salad consisting of roasted asparagus and tomatoes, as well as pita with red pepper hummus. Green Chef is so convenient because it does the meal planning, grocery shopping, and most of the preparation for you every single week. So in order to enjoy your own wholesome and high-quality meals from Green Chef, please visit greenchef.us/cold75 in order to receive a total of $75 off. That's $25 off each of your first 3 boxes of Green Chef. Once again, go to greenchef.us/cold75 to earn a total of $75 off, which is $25 off each of your first 3 boxes of Green Chef. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. So, would you say you are suitably outraged by this story yet? I'm not going to turn this whole thing into a massive crusade against the death penalty, because that's way too complex an issue for one episode. But I will say that this story is a case study in how horribly the death penalty can go wrong. Even if Shareef Cousin was actually guilty of this murder, a lot of people still have issues with the idea of executing someone who was only 16 years old at the time he committed the crime. I mean, it's not like this type of thing was unprecedented, as the United States has executed a few people for committing some pretty heinous murders when they were under the age of 18. But if you're going to do something like that, there better be much stronger evidence than one eyewitness who wasn't even wearing her glasses when she saw the crime. In an ironic postscript to this story, only 6 months before Shareef was released from prison, the Supreme Court of the United States made a ruling on the case, Roper v. Simmons, voting 5-4 to bar capital punishment for offenders who commit crimes before the age of 18. The case in question involved a 17-year-old named Christopher Simmons, who was sentenced to death for his involvement in a brutal murder he committed alongside 2 friends. Even though there was no doubt that Simmons was guilty, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to execute someone who committed a crime at that age. So if Shareef Cousin's conviction had occurred 1 decade later, he never would have been sent to death row, but then perhaps his story might not have garnered as much attention. And that is ultimately the most disturbing thing about this case. The people in power clearly knew that they were sending an innocent teenage kid to be executed, but they didn't seem to have any remorse about it. Perhaps they genuinely believed Shareef was the perpetrator when his name first entered the investigation, but once they uncovered concrete evidence that he was at another location at the time the murder took place, that should have been the end of it. Instead, they committed some pretty egregious misconduct in order to secure a conviction at any cost. Shareef's family and his supporters were always convinced that his wrongful conviction was driven by racism, and as we're going to discuss in a little while, the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office has a pretty troubling history of sending innocent African American men to death row. But I can see why the authorities would have felt pretty desperate to close this particular case. To put everything into perspective, New Orleans was experiencing a serious wave of violence in 1995. In the first 3 months alone, there were over 100 murders, including 21 which occurred in a single week. But Michael Gerardi's murder was particularly problematic because it took place in the French Quarter, New Orleans' most popular tourist spot, and tourism is the city's biggest industry. We have an innocent white man who is senselessly shot in the face in cold blood by 3 black men during an armed robbery after leaving a popular restaurant with his date. I'm sure the higher-ups were terrified of a sharp decline in tourism if the perpetrators weren't brought to justice immediately. It's been reported that the New Orleans police chief was notified and brought in only 15 minutes after the crime took place, which should give you an idea of what a top priority it became. Shareef and his supporters believed that since the shooter was a black man, the police were always going to pin the murder on someone, regardless of whether or not they actually did it. To me, one of the biggest red flags here is that even though only one person actually shot Michael Gerardi, he still had 2 accomplices with him when it happened. Yet when Shareef was charged with the murder, it does not seem like the police made any attempt to find these 2 accomplices, even though they were technically accessories. That signifies to me that they knew Shareef was not the killer. If you're so convinced you have the right guy, why not try to bring everyone to justice for their role in this crime? Now, one of the strangest aspects of this case is that before his murder trial even took place, Shareef willingly pled guilty to 4 unrelated counts of armed robbery, even though he insists he was innocent of those particular crimes as well. As a result, when Shareef had his murder conviction overturned, he did not actually get released from prison, since he still had to finish serving time on those robbery charges. This is reminiscent of the episode I did a few weeks ago about the murder of Ashley Estelle, as the man sent to death row for killing her, Michael Blair, was exonerated, but he still had to remain in prison because he had received multiple life sentences on unrelated child molestation charges. Of course, while Shareef Cousin is nowhere near as dangerous a criminal as Michael Blair is, he would probably be the first person to tell you that he was no angel. He was definitely a troubled kid at the time he was arrested, and allegedly accompanied his friend, James Rowell, on some armed robberies, though Shareef maintained that he did not do anything more than wait in the car. And of course, we also know that following his release from prison, Shareef stole his boss's identity to commit credit card fraud and wound up back behind bars. It seems like Shareef has finally gotten his life back on track, but he certainly wasn't immune to criminal behavior. It's unclear if Shareef actually was 100% innocent of those 4 counts of armed robbery, but regardless, there are still a number of issues with how the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office handled things. Shareef was potentially looking at 99 years in prison if he was convicted on those robbery charges, which seems pretty harsh for a 16-year-old kid who had no criminal record up until that point. It's pretty sad how Shareef's defense team felt he had no shot of beating the murder charge unless he pled guilty to the armed robberies, as they felt that doing 10 to 20 years in prison was still a better option than facing the death penalty. It was a deliberately dirty, strategic tactic from the district attorney's office to say they were going to try Shareef individually on each of the armed robbery charges before they even put him on trial for murder. There's no way the defense attorneys for a poor African American kid are going to have the money or resources to secure an acquittal in 5 separate trials. But as we're going to talk about momentarily, this is not the first time that this particular district attorney's office has used this tactic. So now we're going to discuss Harry Connick Sr., who was the Orleans Parish District Attorney when Shareef was convicted. You're probably familiar with the famous jazz singer/actor Harry Connick Jr., so yes, Harry Connick Sr. is his father. Connick Sr. was elected district attorney in 1973 when he beat Jim Garrison, who was best known for his investigation into the John F. Kennedy assassination. Connick remained in the position for 30 years until his retirement, and at the time of this recording, he is still alive at the age of 93. But unfortunately, he also seems to be a bit of a douchebag. During his 30-year tenure as district attorney, there were allegations of prosecutorial misconduct in no less than 36 cases his office tried, and 19 of them resulted in either overturned convictions and reduced sentences. Even though Connick did not personally try Shareef Cousin, he was named as a defendant in Shareef's civil suit because of his failure to properly train and supervise his prosecutors. Shareef is not the only innocent person who was sent to death row on Connick's watch, and perhaps the most infamous example of this has a number of parallels to Shareef's case. On December 6, 1984, a businessman named Raymond Liuzza Jr. was fatally shot to death in an armed robbery, and shortly thereafter, two African-American men named John Thompson and Kevin Freeman were arrested for the crime. The murder weapon, and a ring which was stolen from Liuzza, were found in Thompson's possession, but Thompson claimed that Freeman sold him these items after the crime and that he had nothing to do with it. However, Freeman claimed that he and Thompson committed the crime together and that Thompson was the shooter, so he agreed to testify against him in exchange for a 5-year sentence. Shortly after Thompson's arrest, a family recognized his photo in the newspaper and identified him as a man who had robbed them during a carjacking several months earlier. Thompson maintained that he was innocent of both the murder and the carjacking, but Harry Connick Sr. made the strategic decision to try Thompson separately for the carjacking before he took him to trial for murder. As you might have noticed, this is very similar to how the district attorney's office planned to try Shareef 4 separate times for armed robbery before they tried him for murder. In this particular case, Thompson was found guilty of felony carjacking and was sentenced to 49 years in prison. So by the time he went on trial for Raymond Liuzza's murder, Thompson was advised by his attorneys not to testify in his own defense, because if he did, the prosecution would have been able to describe his previous carjacking conviction to the jury. As a result, Thompson was unable to testify that Freeman sold him the gun and Liuzza's ring, so he wound up being found guilty of the murder and sentenced to death. While Thompson languished on death row until a bloodstain which had been left behind by the robber during the carjacking was tested, and it did not match him. It turned out that Connick had already tested the blood at the time of the original trial, but suppressed the results from the defense. As a result, Thompson's carjacking conviction was overturned, and this eventually led to him receiving a new trial on the murder conviction. This time, several new witnesses testified that they had only seen one person running away from the scene when Raymond Liuzza was murdered, and it seemed very likely that Kevin Freeman, who had received a short sentence for testifying against Thompson, was the real killer. As a result, Thompson was acquitted and was finally released from prison after serving 18 years. Thompson later won a $14 million civil lawsuit against Connick and the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office, but Connick appealed the judgment, and the case wound up making it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In the case Connick v. Thompson, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to overturn the $14 million judgment, ruling that the District Attorney's Office was not liable for Thompson's wrongful conviction. This particular case is pretty outrageous in its own right, and could probably be the subject of its own podcast episode, but it just demonstrates that Connick and the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office had a very troubling history of misconduct and railroading innocent people, particularly African Americans, and in the end, there were barely any repercussions at all for what they did to Shareef Cousin. The worst that happened is that the lead prosecutor, Roger Jordan, wound up receiving a 3-month suspension for his misconduct, but would not have to serve it as long as he didn't commit any more ethical violations for a year. So yeah, it was essentially nothing more than probation. But believe it or not, Jordan still had the nerve to attempt to appeal this ruling and complained that it tarnished his record and could affect his future employment prospects. Well, if you don't like it, maybe you shouldn't try to execute innocent 17-year-old kids. It's mind-boggling to me that Jordan would believe that a 3-month suspension is unfair punishment for something that egregious. I mean, putting aside the unethical stuff, like failing to turn over evidence to the defense, it was alleged that Jordan flat-out doctored a tape-recorded interview with Coach Eric White and illegally detained 3 of Shareef's alibi witnesses at the district attorney's office so they would miss their scheduled testimony. These are the actions of someone who clearly knew they were railroading an innocent person, but did not care. Even though Harry Connick Sr. was not directly involved in this trial, you can see why he was named as a defendant in the civil suit, because he had created a culture where his prosecutors believed they could get away with stuff like this without any consequences. Now, I've seen a number of cases where the state offered plea deals to wrongly convicted people which would allow them to plead guilty and walk out of prison. It's a convenient tactic which allows them to save face without actually having to admit they made a mistake and convicted an innocent person. The district attorney's office attempted to do the same thing with Shareef, and he turned it down, but what's remarkable is that it was literally only hours later when Connick publicly announced that they were dropping the case. You see, the main reason inmates are sometimes willing to accept these plea deals is because it means they can immediately walk out of prison, but Shareef was still going to have to serve more years on the armed robbery charges, so what motivation would he have to plead guilty to murder? This was a pretty pathetic attempt at damage control. Anyway, even though many people believe the racism played a role in Shareef's wrongful conviction, it should be noted that the jury who found him guilty actually consisted of 10 blacks and 2 whites. You might be wondering how they could have reached that verdict with so much convincing alibi evidence to support Shareef's innocence, but the testimony from traumatized victims who personally witnessed the crime can have a strong impact on juries. Anyone who follows wrongful conviction cases knows how unreliable eyewitness testimony can be, and it has played a role in sending a number of innocent people to prison. But back in 1996, the average jury member probably wouldn't have known that, and when they saw Connie Babin point to Shareef in the courtroom and positively identify him as the man who shot Michael Gerardi, I'm sure they had no reason to doubt her, particularly since her earlier statements about not getting a good look at the killer were suppressed from the trial. It would be easy to feel angry towards Connie for identifying Shareef, but let's not forget that she went through a pretty traumatic ordeal herself, and I'd say there's a good chance she was pressured or manipulated by investigators. I've seen a couple of wrongful conviction cases in which eyewitnesses have recanted their original testimony, claiming that even though they weren't sure that the defendant was actually the person they saw committing the crime, the police assured them that they had the right person, but if they could still identify the defendant at trial, it would strengthen their case and improve their chances of conviction. I don't believe Connie was knowingly implicating an innocent person. I think she genuinely believed that police arrested the right guy. She probably did not expect her testimony to be the crux of the prosecution's entire case. I don't mean to make light of the whole thing, but this situation reminds me of the scene in the comedy My Cousin Vinny, where Joe Pesci cross-examines the witness who positively identified the perpetrators, even though she had bad eyesight and wore very thick glasses. Yeah, people should not be sent to death row over things like this. So let's talk a bit about James Rowell, the guy who originally implicated Shareef to begin with. I do not think anyone was expecting him to recant his story on the witness stand and say that he had lied about Shareef bragging that he committed the murder. When Rowell admitted that he was facing 800 years in prison for multiple armed robberies, but was offered a lesser sentence for testifying against Shareef, you could understand how the situation unfolded. Testimony from unreliable criminal informants is another primary cause of wrongful convictions, as demonstrated by the aforementioned John Thompson case, where the likely real killer, Kevin Freeman, made a deal to testify against him. I don't think the lead detective on this case, Anthony Small, ever faced any repercussions for his conduct, but some of the allegations against him are insane. In order to secure the arrest warrant for Shareef, he completely fabricated 2 other eyewitnesses to the crime who did not even exist, and he supposedly phoned in a tip about Shareef to Crime Stoppers so he could collect the reward. I mean, it's bad enough that a police officer could railroad an innocent person for the purposes of closing a case, but when they're also profiting and receiving reward money for it, that shows an almost cartoonish level of corruption. As sad as it is to say, even though he went through a terrible ordeal, Shareef actually wound up better than many others in his situation, as he only had to spend 2.5 years on death row, as opposed to someone like John Thompson, who had to endure this for 18 years before he walked free. But the situation was extra terrifying for Shareef because of his young age, as he did not even understand how the death penalty and its appeals process worked at that time. Since he was never given an execution date, his time on death row was filled with uncertainty about how long he had left to live. I know Shareef ran into some legal trouble following his release, but I hope that he's truly turned his life around, though he probably won't receive full vindication until someone else is actually charged with Michael Gerardi's murder. But there's one tragic aspect of this case which always gets overlooked. While Shareef is definitely a victim in this case, his story wound up taking a lot of the attention away from Michael, the person who lost his life. Sadly, one of the biggest side effects of wrongful conviction cases is that the actual murder victim often gets overlooked. Believe it or not, when I was researching this story, I could not find one photograph of Michael Gerardi online. It was only after I watched a YouTube documentary about this case, containing snippets of old news segments, that I finally saw what Michael looked like. These news segments contain interviews with Michael's parents, who seemed pretty devastated by the whole ordeal, and I'm sure it must have been difficult for them to think they received closure when someone was convicted of Michael's murder, only to find out that they got the wrong person. There really isn't much information out there about Michael, but from what I can tell, he sounded like a sweet guy. It seems like he had really fallen for Connie, and even told his mother, quote-unquote, "this may be the one," before they even went out on their first date. When Michael showed up for the date, he gave Connie a red rose, and things seemed to be going really well until an unspeakable tragedy took place. I think it demonstrates what kind of guy Michael was, that when he felt threatened by the 3 black males approaching them, his first instinct was to turn to Connie and tell her to run away, a decision which possibly saved her life, since she may have been shot as well if she had remained there. This was a completely senseless crime, because I'm sure that if the perpetrator simply ordered Michael to hand over his wallet at gunpoint, he likely would have done so without any resistance, and there was no need to kill him. This really isn't a complex crime to analyze, as it appears the only motive was robbery, and Michael was just an unfortunate random victim. But who could have been responsible? Well, it turns out that investigators had turned up a fairly promising lead, which pointed toward alternate suspects. On the night of the murder, Crime Stoppers received a tip from an eyewitness who was in the French Quarter when Michael's shooting took place. Since the man was a bird watcher, he often carried around his binoculars and used them to catch a glimpse of the license plate number on the perpetrator's getaway car. The number wound up matching a red 1989 Ford Escort registered to a woman named Crystal Baham. Just over a week later, Crime Stoppers received another tip from an anonymous caller who implicated 3 potential suspects in the crime: Antonio Harper, Derek Smith, and a third person known only as Brandon. When investigators attempted to track down Antonio Harper, they discovered a red Ford Escort parked outside his address. It had the same license number provided by the birdwatcher, and it turned out that the registered owner, Crystal Baham, was Derek Smith's mother. However, once Shareef was charged with the crime, the investigation against these 3 suspects was dropped, and of course, none of this information was ever turned over to Shareef's defense team at trial. Now, there really isn't much information out there about the alternate suspects, but I did manage to find an obituary for a New Orleans resident named Derek Smith, who died in December of 2016 at the age of 40. Since it listed Crystal Baham as his mother, this is definitely the same guy. Interestingly enough, I also found an obituary for a Robert Harper, a New Orleans man who passed away in September of 2017, and it lists Crystal Baham as his sister, so I can only assume he's related to Antonio Harper. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to accuse Harper, Smith, and the third guy named Brandon of being Michael Gerardi's killers, but I think that if investigators had been able to continue pursuing these guys, they could have potentially built a case against them. It's worth noting that this particular lead was investigated by 3 other detectives besides Anthony Small, who pretty much pushed their work to the side when he set his sights on Shareef. It seems like the moment James Rowell said Shareef's name, Small decided that he was their fall guy and they were going to pin the crime on him no matter what. And that's one of the most frustrating things about this story. I know law enforcement desperately wanted to solve this case, but they may have actually had the right guys on the radar, yet they ultimately chose to railroad an innocent kid. I mean, my God, when you consider the amount of work police and prosecutors had to do in order to fabricate a case against Shareef, they might as well have devoted all that energy to actually, finding the real killers. I mean, if these guys were brazen enough to shoot an innocent man on a public street just to steal his wallet, who knows how many other crimes they may have gone on to commit. But even after Shareef's conviction was overturned, the people in power still continued to maintain that he was the right guy, and it would not surprise me at all if they still hold the same attitude 2 decades later. If so, then I can't see anyone else being brought to justice for this crime. All that being said, if you happen to have any information on the murder of Michael Gerardi, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty cool rewards. We've already produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and our most recent episode covers the murder of 14-year-old Ricky Ann Blake, whose family would be targeted with a series of bizarre anonymous phone calls over the next several years. We've also implemented a bonus reward for our patrons in tier 3, in which I record my own audio commentary track to be played over episodes of Unsolved Mysteries. I did my most recent commentary over an episode featuring some all-time classic segments, including the murder of Terry McClure, the murder for hire of T.K. Hardy, and the infamous story of Liz Carmichael and her fraudulent 3-wheeled car known as the Dale. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our most recent listeners who have signed up to support us on Patreon this week, and they are Linda B., Lisa A., Allison, Bill H., Ani, Brett I., and Steph. Thank you all so much for your support. You probably heard me announce that I'll be returning to Toronto this summer to participate in another true crime podcasting event, which will take place at the Royal Cinema on the afternoon of August the 18th. In addition to myself, other podcasters who will be in attendance include Christy from Canadian True Crime, Jordan from the Nighttime Podcast, Nina from Already Gone, and Aaron from Generation Y. The event will include case presentations, panel discussions, an interactive Q&A, and a meet and greet. Tickets are $25 each, and you can find the link to the website to purchase them in our episode description. In addition, I will also be appearing at the True Crime Podcast Festival, being held at the Marriott Downtown Hotel in Chicago on July 13th. Dozens of your favorite true crime podcasters will be there, and I will be teaming up with Christy from Canadian True Crime to do a live show in which we'll be discussing some Canadian cases. So to learn more information about this event and to purchase tickets, feel free to visit their website at tcpf2019.com. Also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. Anyway, before I close things out, I would just like to send out a special message to one of our listeners, Darren Fuchs, whose birthday falls on the day after this episode's release. So on behalf of your wife Megan Happy birthday, Darren. And for the final time, I would like to remind you all that I am heading to New Orleans for CrimeCon this upcoming weekend, which is being held at the Hilton Riverside Hotel from June 7th until the 9th. I'm going to be at my booth on Podcast Row at various points throughout the event, so if any of you listeners are attending, feel free to stop by and say hi. There are also probably going to be some meetups for podcasters and listeners, so be sure to check for any announcements on social media. Anyway, I hope to see some of you folks there, so have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.